Welcome to the Artificial Fluency podcast, where we explore the intersection of politics, policy, and current events. I'm your host, John, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Emma. How are you doing today, Emma?
I'm doing well, John. There's certainly no shortage of political developments to discuss these days.
That's for sure. And today we have a special guest joining us who has unique insight into the inner workings of the current administration. We're thrilled to welcome Daniel Smith, a former senior advisor in the Trump White House. Daniel, thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, John. Always happy to share my perspective.
So Daniel, you had a front row seat to the policymaking process in the early days of the Trump presidency. As we approach the final months of President Trump's first term, what would you say are the administration's top policy priorities and expectations?
Well, John, I think it's important to first understand the unique approach that President Trump takes to governing. He came into office as an outsider, someone who had never held elected office before, and he promised to shake things up, to challenge the status quo in Washington. So in terms of policy priorities, the administration has really focused on a few key areas that resonate with the president's base: immigration, trade, deregulation, and judicial appointments. On immigration, the expectation is to continue the crackdown on illegal immigration, to build more of the border wall, and to limit legal immigration as well. The president sees this as a key part of his America First agenda.
And we've certainly seen that play out with controversial policies like the travel ban, family separations at the border, and attempts to end programs like DACA.
That's right, Emma. The administration views immigration control as a core priority, both in terms of national security and protecting American jobs. They've also had some key wins, like securing funding for more border barriers and reaching agreements with Mexico and Central American countries to curb migrant caravans. Going forward, I'd expect to see a continued push on these fronts, as well as potential further restrictions on work visas, refugee admissions, and other forms of legal immigration.
What about trade policy, Daniel? This is another area where President Trump has broken with the Washington establishment and pursued a more protectionist, confrontational approach.
Absolutely, John. President Trump believes strongly that the U.S. has been taken advantage of by trading partners like China. Renegotiating trade deals like NAFTA and cracking down on what the administration views as unfair trade practices have been a major focus. The Phase 1 trade deal with China was a significant milestone, but the expectation is that the administration will continue to press China on issues like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and currency manipulation. They want to fundamentally reset that economic relationship. I'd also note the importance of the USMCA trade deal with Mexico and Canada. Updating NAFTA was a key campaign promise for President Trump, so getting that done was a major policy win. Going forward, I think we can expect the administration to continue its aggressive use of tariffs as a negotiating tool, to pursue bilateral trade deals rather than multilateral agreements, and to prioritize reducing trade deficits. This peace-through-strength approach on trade is central to the president's worldview.
Let's turn to the topic of deregulation. This has been another defining policy thrust of the Trump era, the idea of rolling back Obama-era regulations and generally reducing the role of government in the economy. Daniel, talk us through the administration's approach here.
Emma, deregulation has indeed been a core focus from day one. President Trump came into office believing that excessive regulation was stifling economic growth, particularly in sectors like energy, manufacturing, and finance. So there's been a very methodical effort across government agencies to identify and eliminate regulations deemed unnecessary or overly burdensome. The expectation is that by cutting red tape, businesses can flourish, leading to more jobs and higher wages. A couple key examples: rolling back Obama-era environmental regulations like the Clean Power Plan and fuel efficiency standards, as well as dismantling regulations on the financial sector that were put in place after the 2008 crisis. This often hasn't gotten as much attention as some of the higher profile issues like immigration or trade, but it's been a huge priority behind the scenes. The administration boasts that they've cut 8 regulations for every new one implemented.
Daniel, this deregulatory push has been highly controversial, though. Critics argue that it's putting the interests of corporations ahead of public health, worker safety, and environmental protection. How does the administration respond to that?
The administration's view, John, is that it's restoring balance to the regulatory process. That for too long, unelected bureaucrats have had unchecked power to issue regulations that impose huge costs on the economy without sufficient accountability. So by requiring a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis, by giving regulated industries more of a voice in the rulemaking process, they believe it's a win-win, maintaining necessary protections while reducing unnecessary burdens on job creators. But you're right, it's been a huge fight. Environmental groups, consumer advocates, labor unions, they've all pushed back hard, taking the administration to court at every turn. So it hasn't always been smooth sailing. I'd say the expectation in a second term would be to continue on the same trajectory, to lock in as many of these regulatory rollbacks as possible, both through executive action and by appointing like-minded regulators. It's a core part of the president's pro-growth economic vision.
Let's talk about another huge priority for President Trump that you mentioned earlier, Daniel, judicial appointments. This has really been a defining issue of his presidency.
Without a doubt, Emma, reshaping the federal judiciary has been one of the quiet triumphs of the Trump administration. It of course starts with the 2 Supreme Court appointments, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, which cemented a conservative majority on the High Court. But it goes well beyond that. The administration, in close partnership with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, has made it a laser focus to appoint young conservative judges to lifelong positions on lower courts as well. The numbers are quite staggering. Over 200 federal judges confirmed, including a record number of appellate judges. In fact, President Trump has appointed about a quarter of all active federal judges at this point. The expectation is that this will be a legacy-defining achievement, one that will shape rulings on everything from abortion to gun rights to regulatory power for a generation. It's a huge victory for the conservative legal movement.
Daniel, as someone who was in the room when many of these judicial appointments were considered, what is the administration's process for identifying and vetting these nominees?
It's a highly coordinated effort, John, led by the White House counsel's office in close consultation with outside groups like the Federalist Society. The goal is to find candidates who are highly qualified, but also have a clear conservative judicial philosophy, originalists and textualists in the mold of the late Justice Scalia. There's an intensive vetting process, scrubbing past writings and rulings, conducting interviews, strategizing about Senate confirmation. It's high stakes because, as we've seen, the more high-profile picks often become intense ideological battles. But the results speak for themselves in terms of the numbers and caliber of judges appointed. It's really been an unprecedented effort to shape the third branch of government, and I'd fully expect it to continue in a second term. It's a huge priority, both for the president and the Republican legal establishment.
As we start to wrap up, I want to zoom out a bit. Daniel, when you think about the next 4 years if President Trump is re-elected, what's the overall policy vision? Is it more of the same, or are there new priorities on the horizon?
I think it's largely about doubling down on the America First agenda, John. The big policy thrusts that we've discussed, immigration, trade, deregulation, conservative judges, those will absolutely continue. But there are some new areas of focus emerging as well. Healthcare reform remains unfinished business. The president has promised a replacement for Obamacare. On infrastructure, there's talk of a potential bipartisan push for a major bill. Foreign policy could be an area to watch as well. With the wind down of the Mueller investigation and impeachment behind him, President Trump may feel more empowered to put his personal stamp on diplomacy, the relationship with North Korea, the Middle East peace process, a new nuclear deal with Iran. These are all spaces where he's broken with conventional wisdom in the past. Of course, so much depends on the makeup of Congress after the election as well. If Republicans hold the Senate and retake the House, it could give new life to conservative legislative priorities. But if Democrats have a strong showing, it could be more gridlock and investigations.
Daniel, a final question. Much of President Trump's policy agenda in the first term was enacted through executive orders and agency actions rather than legislation. Do you expect that to continue? And how much do you worry about the durability of those actions if a Democratic president comes into office in the future?
It's a great point, Emma. So many of the administration's key policies on immigration, environment, healthcare have come through executive action rather than the legislative process. That's been a necessity in divided government, but it does create uncertainty. I think the expectation in a second term would be to try to lock in as many of these changes as possible through rulemaking and litigation. But you're right, a future Democratic administration could certainly look to reverse many of them. That's why the appointment of conservative judges is so crucial. They could serve as a bulwark against rapid policy swings. But there's no question that legislating policy changes is more durable than going through executive order. I'd expect a mixed approach going forward, taking executive action where necessary, but also looking for opportunities to cement policy gains through statute if the political winds allow. It's a balancing act.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Daniel, thank you so much for your insights into the Trump administration's policy priorities and expectations for a potential second term. It's been a truly fascinating conversation.
My pleasure, John. There's certainly a lot to watch in the months ahead.
And thanks to my co-host, Emma, as well. Up next on Artificial Fluency, we'll be diving into the latest developments in the 2020 presidential race, including a look at the upcoming conventions. Stay tuned.
See you next time.